June 4th, 1942, 10,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky scanned the empty ocean below, his fuel gauge showing numbers that meant his 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers had perhaps 15 minutes before they'd have to turn back or ditch in the sea. For 2 hours, he'd led his squadrons from the carrier Enterprise, searching for the Japanese fleet that intelligence promised would be here. The ocean remained stubbornly empty. Then, at 1005 hours, McClusky spotted a lone Japanese destroyer far below, cutting a white wake as it raced northeast at maximum speed. The destroyer Arashi, having just finished dropping depth charges on an American submarine, was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McClusky made a decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. He followed the destroyer's wake. 20 minutes later, the horizon ahead filled with ships. 4 aircraft carriers steaming in a box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The entire striking force of the Japanese combined fleet, the same armada that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. McClusky's radio crackled as he coordinated with squadrons from Yorktown, arriving simultaneously from a different direction. What none of the American pilots knew was that they were about to prove the value of a technology Japanese naval aviators had dismissed as evidence of American technical inferiority. The perforated split flaps mounted beneath their wings, crude air brakes that allowed controlled near-vertical dives, would in the next 5 minutes destroy Japan's carrier striking power and shift the strategic balance in the Pacific so completely that Japan would never recover. The mathematics of dive bombing accuracy were being written not in complex aerodynamic formulas, but in the simple physics of controlled vertical descent. The Japanese had studied dive bombing and concluded it was tactically impractical. The Americans had developed a simple mechanical solution that made the impossible routine. The story of how perforated metal flaps attached to wings transformed naval aviation begins not with the war, but with the peacetime skepticism about dive bombing as a practical combat technique. The concept of dive bombing emerged during World War I, when pilots discovered that diving toward targets improved accuracy compared to level bombing. German aviators experimented with steep diving attacks, achieving modest success despite lacking proper equipment or techniques. The problem was fundamental. An aircraft diving toward a target accelerates rapidly under gravity. By the time it reaches an altitude where the pilot can accurately aim at the target, the aircraft is traveling so fast that pulling out of the dive generates G-forces that can cause the pilot to black out or can tear the aircraft apart. Early dive bombers either pulled out too high, sacrificing accuracy, or dove too steeply and couldn't recover safely. During the 1920s, the United States Navy studied dive bombing methodically. Test pilots at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia conducted experiments diving at various angles. They discovered that accuracy improved dramatically with steeper diving angles. A 30-degree glide bombing approach achieved acceptable accuracy against large targets like battleships. A 60-degree dive bombing attack could hit cruisers reliably. A 70-degree near-vertical dive could theoretically place bombs on targets as small as destroyers with devastating accuracy. But 70-degree dives created impossible problems. Aircraft accelerated to terminal velocity within seconds. Pilots attempting to aim through vibrating windscreens at 300 min-ph, while experiencing tunnel vision from G-forces, couldn't hit anything. Those who did manage to aim and release bombs then faced the problem of pulling out. The G-forces required to recover from a 70-degree dive at low altitude regularly caused pilots to black out. Several test pilots died when their aircraft plunged into the ocean or ground while they were unconscious. The Navy needed a way to limit diving speed while maintaining the steep attack angle. In 1931, engineer Ernst Heinkel in Germany developed a solution while working on dive bomber designs for the emerging Luftwaffe. Heinkel created perforated split flaps that extended from the trailing edge of the wing. When deployed, these flaps acted like air brakes, creating tremendous drag that slowed the aircraft even in a vertical dive. The pilot could dive at 70 or even 80 degrees, maintain a speed slow enough for accurate aiming and safe recovery, and deliver bombs with unprecedented precision. The German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka incorporated Heinkel's dive brakes and became the most effective close air support aircraft of the early war. Stuka pilots over Poland, France, and the Low Countries achieved remarkable accuracy, destroying bridges, bunkers, and armored vehicles with what seemed like surgical precision. But the Stuka's success came with limitations that would prove critical. The dive brakes and fixed landing gear created so much drag that the aircraft's maximum speed was only 240 meticulously. When facing modern fighters, Stukas were massacred. During the Battle of Britain in summer 1940, Stuka losses became so catastrophic that the Luftwaffe withdrew them from combat over England. Japanese naval aviation observers studying European combat drew specific conclusions. Dive bombing was effective against ground targets when air superiority existed. Against defended naval targets with fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire, dive bombers were too slow and vulnerable. The future belonged to high-speed level bombing and torpedo attack. Japan's premier carrier bomber, the Aichi D-3A Val, did incorporate dive brakes and could execute steep dives, but Japanese doctrine emphasized speed and maneuverability over diving precision. The Val could reach 267 mph in level flight, significantly faster than the Stuka, but this required compromises in dive brake effectiveness. American naval aviation took a different path. The Douglas Aircraft Company, responding to a 1938 Navy specification for a scout bomber, designed an aircraft specifically optimized for dive bombing. The SBD Dauntless featured perforated split flaps that could create massive drag during diving attacks. These flaps, mounted on the trailing edge of each wing, split apart and extended when the pilot activated them. The perforations allowed air to flow through, preventing buffeting that could affect control. When fully deployed, the flaps increased drag so dramatically that a Dauntless could dive at 70 degrees while maintaining a steady 250 mph, slow enough for precise aim and safe recovery. Japanese intelligence officers examining photographs of the SBD in 1941 noted the prominent dive brakes and filed reports that revealed profound underestimation. The assessment characterized the dive brakes as crude appendages that suggested American designers couldn't create aircraft with sufficient speed for modern combat. One intelligence summary from October 1941 stated that American carrier aircraft relied on air brakes because they lacked the engine power for high-speed attack profiles. The implication was clear. American aviation technology lagged behind Japanese capabilities. This assessment reflected broader Japanese confidence in their naval aviation. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter dominated opponents in China and showed performance exceeding American fighters in every category except dive speed and armor protection. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber could reach 235 mph while carrying a torpedo, making it faster than most American dive bombers. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized speed and flexibility with aircraft that could perform multiple roles. American doctrine seemed primitive by comparison, with specialized aircraft designed for single missions. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, seemed to validate Japanese confidence. Zeros swept American fighters from the sky. Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers devastated Battleship Row. Within 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line was destroyed. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 55 aircrew. American losses were catastrophic: 5 battleships sunk, 3 damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans dead. Japanese naval aviators returned to their carriers convinced of their absolute superiority over American forces. Through the first 6 months of war, Japanese carrier aviation dominated the Pacific. At Darwin, Australia, on February 19, 1942, Aircraft from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu sank 8 ships and destroyed 23 aircraft while suffering minimal losses. At Ceylon in April 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft sank the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and a destroyer. 0 fighters shot down 40 defending aircraft. The myth of Japanese invincibility in carrier operations seemed confirmed by every engagement. American carrier forces, operating with the same SBD Dauntless dive bombers that Japanese intelligence had dismissed, achieved mixed results. At the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7, 1942, SBDs from Lexington and Yorktown managed to sink the light carrier Shoho and damage the fleet carrier Shokaku. But the attacks required multiple waves, consumed hours, and succeeded partly through Japanese mistakes. The Americans lost carrier Lexington, and Yorktown was damaged. Tactically, the battle was nearly even. Strategically, it prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, but it hardly suggested American carrier aviation could challenge the combined fleet in decisive battle. The dive breaks that would soon prove decisive remained unappreciated even by many American pilots. The SBD was not a beloved aircraft. Pilots called it slow but deadly, with sarcasm more than affection. It was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable than the Val, and couldn't carry as heavy a torpedo load as the Kate. Its Wright R-1820 radial engine produced 1,000 horsepower, adequate but unimpressive. Maximum speed of 255 mph seemed pathetic compared to the Zero's 331 mph. The SBD's 250 caliber forward-firing machine guns were inferior to the Zero's 220 mm cannon. Pilots transitioning from fighters to SBDs felt they were being demoted to flying trucks. What these pilots learned through training was that the SBD's dive brakes transformed it into something unprecedented: a stable bombing platform at terminal velocity. During dive bombing training at Naval Air Station North Island, near San Diego, instructor pilots taught a technique that seemed suicidal until experienced firsthand. The pilot would roll inverted at altitude, pull through until the nose pointed straight down at the target, extend the dive brakes, and enter a 70-degree dive. The aircraft would accelerate initially, then stabilize at 250 mph as the drag from the deployed flaps balanced the gravitational acceleration. At 250 mph in a 70-degree dive, the pilot could see the target clearly despite the steep angle. The bomb sight, a simple telescopic sight mounted ahead of the windscreen, remained steady enough for accurate aim. The pilot would watch the target grow larger in the sight, waiting for the precise moment when the target filled the reticle markings. At that moment, typically at 2,500 feet altitude, the pilot would press the bomb release. The 1,000-pound bomb would continue downward, while the aircraft, suddenly 1,000 pounds lighter, would become more responsive. The pilot would retract the dive brakes and pull back hard on the stick. G-forces would compress him into his seat as the aircraft transitioned from vertical descent to level flight, typically completing the pullout at about 500 feet above the water. The mathematics of this attack profile were brutal for the target and the defender. A bomb dropped from a 70-degree dive at 2,500 feet, released from an aircraft traveling 250 mph, would impact the target approximately 4 seconds after release. Those 4 seconds gave the target almost no time to maneuver. A ship moving at 30 knots travels 200 feet in 4 seconds. But the ship's captain, watching the dive bomber approach, couldn't know the exact moment of bomb release. By the time he observed the bomb falling and ordered evasive maneuvers, the rudder response time meant the ship would barely begin turning before impact. The defending fighters faced an equally impossible problem. A dive bomber approaching at altitude was vulnerable, but once committed to the dive, it became extraordinarily difficult to stop. Fighter pilots attempting to follow a diving bomber found their aircraft accelerating past 400 mph, creating control problems and blurred vision. Attempting to fire accurately while diving at extreme speed proved nearly impossible. The dive bomber, stabilized by its air brakes at a steady 250 mi/dish, presented a target that was simultaneously slow and nearly impossible to hit. Pulling out of the dive and climbing back to altitude consumed altitude and time that fighters attacking from above couldn't spare if they wanted to stop the bomb from being released. By May 1942, SBD squadrons from American carriers had refined their doctrine through combat experience. The standard approach involved approaching the target at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range. Upon sighting the target, the squadron leader would position his aircraft over the target, then roll inverted and pull through into a 70-degree dive. His wingmen would follow at 5-second intervals, creating a string of dive bombers that would attack sequentially. Each pilot would deploy dive brakes upon entering the dive, stabilize at 250 mm/h, track the target through the bomb site, release at 2,500 feet, retract dive brakes, and pull out at 500 feet. The entire sequence from roll-in to pull-out took approximately 35 seconds per aircraft. Japanese carrier doctrine had no effective counter to this attack profile. 0 fighters optimized for air superiority, and bomber escort lacked the diving speed to catch SBDs in their attack dives. Anti-aircraft fire, while intense, proved largely ineffective against small aircraft diving at steep angles and high speed. The 4-second window between bomb release and impact gave ships no time to maneuver effectively. Japanese carrier captains trained extensively in avoiding torpedo attacks, which required predictable low-level approaches. But dive bombing attacks came from directly above with no warning except the sight of aircraft rolling into their dives. The stage was set for the confrontation that would validate or disprove each side's doctrine and technology. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, planned an operation to force the remaining American carriers into decisive battle where superior Japanese forces would destroy them. The target was Midway Atoll, a strategic outpost that the Americans would have to defend. Yamamoto assembled the most powerful naval force in Japanese history: 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers in the carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Additional task forces included invasion transports, a diversionary force attacking the Aleutian Islands, and Yamamoto's main body with 3 battleships and a light carrier. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes, knew the attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, positioned his available forces to ambush the Japanese fleet. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired from Coral Sea damage, with their escorts would lie in wait northeast of Midway. The carriers embarked approximately 230 aircraft total, including 112 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Against them, Nagumo's 4 carriers carried 248 aircraft, including 84 Zero fighters and 84 Val dive bombers. On paper, forces seemed roughly balanced. In reality, the Americans possessed critical advantages they didn't fully recognize. Their intelligence had given them strategic surprise. Their SBD dive bombers had technological capabilities Japanese planners had underestimated, and they were defending a fixed position, which meant Japanese forces had to approach predictably, while American forces could position for ambush. The battle began before dawn on June 4, 1942, when Japanese scout planes launched a search for American carriers. Nagumo's primary mission was destroying Midway's air defenses to prepare for the invasion. His aircraft first struck Midway at 0630 hours, encountering fierce resistance from Marine Corps fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The strike damaged facilities, but didn't suppress Midway's defenses. At 0700 hours, the strike leader radioed Nagumo that a second attack would be necessary. Nagumo faced a dilemma. He'd held back a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American carriers appeared. With no carriers reported and Midway still dangerous, he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack weapons, regular bombs, and incendiaries. Deck crews began the laborious process of striking torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs below to the magazines, bringing up conventional bombs and reloading aircraft. At low 28 hours, a Japanese scout plane finally reported sighting American ships. At E-809 hours, a follow-up report added the critical detail. The American force included a carrier. Nagumo immediately reversed his rearmament order. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs came back up from magazines. Conventional bombs were struck below. The carrier decks descended into organized chaos as crews hustled to prepare for a carrier attack they'd expected, but hadn't found when anticipated. Meanwhile, American carriers had launched everything they had. Beginning at 700 hours, strike. Aircraft took off from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The plan called for coordinated attacks. Torpedo bombers would approach at wave-top height, forcing Japanese carriers to maneuver violently and allowing dive bombers to attack from altitude against targets that couldn't evade. But coordination failed. The air group from Hornet became separated. Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese carriers alone at 0920 hours and attacked immediately without fighter escort or dive bomber support. What followed was massacre. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8 pressed their attacks against all four carriers. Zeros swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships converged. The slow, low-flying Devastators were annihilated. Every aircraft was shot down. 29 of the 30 aircrew died, including Squadron Commander Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. The sole survivor, Ensign George Gay, clung to a floating seat cushion among the Japanese fleet, watching what happened next. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked at 0940 hours. Of 14 aircraft, 10 were shot down. 4 survivors limped back to Enterprise, having achieved nothing. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked at 1000 hours. Of 12 aircraft, 10 were shot down. In 40 minutes, the 3 American torpedo squadrons lost 35 of 41 aircraft and scored no hits. The survivors later reported the futility: slow aircraft, defective torpedoes, overwhelming fighter opposition, and targets that maneuvered violently. Every pilot who survived swore the torpedo attack doctrine was suicidal and obsolete. From the Japanese perspective, at 1020 hours, the battle seemed decisively won. 3 separate American attacks had been completely defeated. Not a single Japanese ship was damaged. Zeros had shot down 38 American aircraft. The American carriers, having revealed their positions and expended their torpedoes, now seemed vulnerable. Nagumo's aircraft were nearly ready to launch. Within 30 minutes, Japanese strike aircraft would depart to destroy the American carriers. The victory at Pearl Harbor would be completed, but the torpedo attacks, while failing tactically, had succeeded strategically in ways neither side recognized. For 40 minutes, every Zero fighter in Nagumo's combat air patrol had been at sea level, chasing torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been maneuvering violently, turning hard to avoid torpedoes, their decks too unstable for launching or landing aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns had been firing at low-altitude targets. Nobody aboard the Japanese carriers was looking up. At 10,000 feet above, Wade McClusky's 33 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise arrived over the Japanese fleet at precisely 1020 hours, the moment when every defensive asset was focused low. To McClusky's right, 17 SBDs from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, approached simultaneously from a different direction. 50 SBD Dauntlesses, armed with 1,000-pound bombs, held position above 4 Japanese carriers that had no idea they were there. McClusky identified the carriers below: Akagi and Kaga to the west, Soryu and Hiryu to the east. He ordered his squadrons to split. Bombing Squadron 6 would attack Kaga. Scouting Squadron 6 would hit Akagi. Leslie's Yorktown aircraft would strike Soryu. Only Hiryu would escape immediate attack. At 10:22 hours, McClusky rolled his SBD inverted and pulled through into a 70-degree dive toward Kaga. Behind him, his wingmen followed at 5-second intervals. To the south, Leslie simultaneously rolled into his dive towards Soryu. The dive breaks that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as primitive technology now proved their worth. Each SBD pilot extended the perforated split flaps as he transitioned to vertical descent. The crude-looking metal surfaces deployed smoothly, creating massive drag. The aircraft, which would have accelerated past 400 mph in an unrestricted dive, stabilized at 250 mph. At this speed, despite the 70-degree angle and the screaming wind, the bomb sight remained steady. The target appeared clearly centered in the telescopic sight. The pilots, veterans who had practiced this exact maneuver hundreds of times, tracked their targets with precision that level bombing could never achieve. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the first warning came at 10,024 hours when lookouts spotted aircraft diving from directly above. Anti-aircraft guns swung upward, but the steep diving angles made tracking nearly impossible. The gunners, trained to engage level bombers and low-altitude torpedo planes, found themselves firing at point targets plunging vertically at 250 mph. The fire control computers aboard the escorts couldn't generate firing solutions for vertical targets. The batteries fired anyway, filling the air with exploding shells that created black puffs of smoke that marked altitude but rarely hit the diving aircraft. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6's 1st Division, centered Akagi in his bomb sight. The carrier was turning hard to port, but Best's dive angle meant he was tracking her from directly above where turn radius didn't matter. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled back hard on his stick while retracting the dive brakes. The sudden transition from heavy drag to clean configuration, combined with being 1,000 pounds lighter, made the SBD leap upward. G-forces crushed Best into his seat as his vision tunneled. He pulled out at 500 feet, turned hard right, and headed for open ocean while his rear gunner, aviation radio man, First Class James Murray, fired at pursuing Zeros. Best's bomb, dropped from optimal altitude at optimal angle, fell for 4 seconds before striking Akagi just aft of her midship elevator. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck below, where aircraft packed tightly together were being fueled and armed. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar as aviation gasoline ignited. A second bomb from Best's division hit Akagi near the stern, penetrating to the magazine spaces. A third bomb struck near the bow. 3 bombs in 60 seconds transformed Akagi from the most powerful carrier in the Pacific to a floating funeral pyre. Fires raged through her hangar deck. Fuel lines ruptured, feeding the flames. Ordnance cooked off in the heat, sending shrapnel through bulkheads. The carrier's damage control systems, unprepared for fires this intense, proved inadequate. Within 15 minutes, flames reached the bridge structure. Admiral Nagumo and his staff evacuated to a destroyer. Akagi burned for hours before scuttling charges sent her to the bottom at 0500 hours the next morning. Simultaneously, Bombing Squadron 6's 2nd Division attacked Kaga. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher led his division down through anti-aircraft fire that seemed to fill the entire sky. At 250 meters in a 70-degree dive with dive brakes deployed, Gallagher tracked Kaga through his bomb sight despite the flak explosions buffeting his aircraft. At 2,500 feet, he released. 3 seconds later, his wingman released. Every 5 seconds, another SBD released its bomb. Within 90 seconds, 4 1,000-pound bombs struck Kaga. The first hit near the island superstructure, penetrating to the hangar and exploding among parked aircraft. The second struck the forward elevator, jamming it in the raised position and blocking half the flight deck. The third and fourth hits struck aft, penetrating to spaces where ordnance was stored. The explosions triggered catastrophic secondary detonations as torpedo warheads and bomb payloads exploded sympathetically. Kaga's stern section erupted in a massive fireball visible for 50 miles. The carrier, engulfed in flames from bow to stern, began listing immediately. By 1640 hours, her hull glowing red-hot from internal fires, Kaga rolled over and sank, taking 811 of her 1,108 crew with her. To the south, Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers attacked Soryu with the same devastating precision. Leslie led 17 SBDs into 70-degree dives from 15,000 feet. The perforated dive brakes deployed, stabilizing each aircraft at 250 mm rate. Soryu, still recovering aircraft from the morning's Midway strike, had her deck crowded with planes being fueled and rearmed. Leslie's bomb struck Soryu directly amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. 2 more bombs hit within seconds. 3 1,000-pound bombs in less than a minute detonated among Soryu's fully fueled and armed aircraft. The explosions ignited aviation gasoline and detonated ordnance. Secondary explosions ripped through the carrier. Fires spread with such intensity that her crew couldn't fight them. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto ordered abandon ship at 10:45 hours, though he remained aboard. Soryu sank at 1913 hours, taking Yanagamoto and 718 others down with her. The attack had lasted 5 minutes. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had escaped detection during the initial attack because she was separated from the other 3, but her survival would prove temporary. At 1700 hours, 24 SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown located Hiryu. Led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher and Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, the Dauntlesses executed the same attack profile that had destroyed the other carriers. 70-degree dives with dive brakes deployed, stable descent at 250 meters, bomb release at 2,500 feet. 4 bombs struck Hiryu, setting her ablaze. She burned through the night before sinking at Oro 900 hours on June 5th. In one day, dive bombers dismissed by Japanese intelligence as crude and primitive had destroyed 4 fleet carriers, the heart of Japanese naval striking power. The SBD Dauntless, derided as slow but deadly, had sunk more tonnage in 6 hours than any other aircraft type would sink in the entire war. The perforated split flaps that Japanese analysts had cited as evidence of American technological backwardness had enabled the most devastatingly precise naval strikes in history. The technical specifications of what made the SBD's dive brakes revolutionary deserve examination. Each perforated split flap measured approximately 36 inches in chord and ran nearly the length of the wing's trailing edge. When deployed, the upper and lower sections split apart, extending into the airstream at roughly 90-degree angles. The perforations, carefully calculated holes through the metal surface, served multiple purposes. They allowed airflow through the flaps, preventing the buffeting and vibration that solid flaps would create. They provided stable, predictable drag characteristics across varying speeds and attitudes. They created a specific drag coefficient that matched the SBD's weight and aerodynamic profile to achieve the target terminal velocity of 250 mph at 70-degree dive angle. The engineering was deceptively simple. Solid flaps would create turbulent airflow that could cause control problems. The perforations smoothed the flow. The split design allowed the flaps to deploy without significantly affecting the wing's center of pressure, maintaining stable flight characteristics. The mechanical actuation system was robust enough to function reliably under combat conditions, but simple enough that maintenance crews could service it easily. Japanese engineers examining captured SBDs after Midway recognized immediately what their pre-war intelligence assessments had missed. American designers had solved the fundamental dive bombing problem with an elegant, reliable, mass-producible solution. The dive brakes weren't evidence of technical backwardness. They were evidence of practical engineering focused on combat effectiveness rather than theoretical performance. The Battle of Midway's outcome changed the strategic balance in the Pacific permanently. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 highly trained aircrew, including many veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. American losses included 1 carrier, Yorktown, sunk by submarine I-168 on June 7th, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. More critically, Japan lost the strategic initiative. Before Midway, Japanese forces had advanced unchecked across the Pacific. After Midway, Japan never again mounted major offensive operations. The remainder of the war became a grinding defensive struggle as American forces advanced steadily westward. The dive bombing doctrine that achieved these results became standard for American carrier aviation. Through the remainder of 1942 and into 1943, SBD Dauntlesses flew from American carriers conducting strikes throughout the Pacific. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, SBDs damaged the carrier Ryujo, contributing to her sinking. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, SBDs damaged carriers Shokaku and Zuiho. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, SBDs and their successor, the SB-2C Helldiver, destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. The production statistics reveal the scale of American commitment to dive bombing. Douglas Aircraft produced 5,136 SBD Dauntlesses between 1940 and 1944. Peak production reached 450 aircraft monthly in 1943. The SBD served with 44 different U.S. Navy squadrons and numerous Marine Corps units. Beyond the Navy and Marines, the Army Air Forces operated SBDs, designated A-24 Banshee, in the Pacific and North Africa. New Zealand, Free French, and Mexican Air Forces operated SBDs in various theaters. The aircraft's combat record speaks to its effectiveness. SBDs sank more enemy shipping than any other Allied aircraft type. Confirmed sinkings included 6 carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and numerous submarines, transports, and smaller vessels. SBDs destroyed hundreds of aircraft in air-to-air combat, despite being designed as bombers. The rear gunner position, armed with twin 30 caliber machine guns, proved surprisingly effective against attacking fighters. SBD rear gunners claimed over 400 aerial victories. Individual pilot achievements demonstrated what the aircraft could accomplish in skilled hands. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley flew SBDs extensively in 1942, developing tactics that maximized the aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure to fighters. His techniques emphasized approaching at high altitude to avoid detection, rolling into coordinated dives to overwhelm defenses, and making one attack pass before egressing at low altitude and high speed. These tactics became doctrine across SBD squadrons. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, better known for developing the Thatch Weave fighter tactic, commanded a dive bomber squadron early in the war and pioneered coordination between dive bombers and torpedo bombers. His insight was that torpedo bombers, while vulnerable, forced enemy carriers to maneuver and prevented them from launching aircraft. This created windows where dive bombers could attack without fighter opposition. The coordination broke, down at Midway due to timing and navigation problems, but when executed properly later in the war, it proved devastating. The Japanese response to dive bombing evolved throughout 1943 and 1944 as their doctrine adapted to American capabilities. Carrier fighter strength increased. Combat air patrol procedures emphasized maintaining fighters at medium altitude where they could intercept dive bombers before attack. Anti-aircraft armament was increased on carriers and escorts. Fire control systems were improved to better track steeply diving targets. But these adaptations came too late and proved insufficient. Japanese carrier losses at Midway were irreplaceable, not just in ships, but in experienced aircrew. The veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had raided Darwin and Ceylon, who had fought at Coral Sea, died at Midway, or in subsequent battles. The replacement pilots lacked combat experience and received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and the accelerating operational tempo. By 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had declined to a shadow of its 1942 capability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal. American carriers operated with overwhelming fighter strength, radar-directed combat air patrols, and highly effective damage control. Japanese carrier strikes, attempting to replicate their 1942 successes, were massacred by American fighters in what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in 2 days. American losses numbered less than 130 aircraft, most lost to operational accidents rather than combat. When American dive bombers and torpedo bombers counterattacked, they sank 3 carriers, including the fleet carrier Taiho. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered. The technological lessons from the dive break story influenced aircraft design throughout the war and beyond. The principle that adding drag at specific times could improve combat effectiveness found applications in multiple designs. German dive bombers adopted perforated dive brakes after observing their effectiveness. Soviet aircraft designers incorporated similar systems in the Petlyakov PE-2 dive bomber. British and American attack aircraft developed dive bombing capabilities with various brake configurations. Post-war jet aircraft adopted sophisticated speed brake systems derived from the same principles. Modern combat aircraft deploy speed brakes to control velocity during weapons delivery, to tighten turning radius in dogfights, and to enable precision approaches for carrier landings. The FA-18 Hornet uses speed brakes on the upper fuselage. The F-15 Eagle deploys a speed brake between its twin tails. These systems are descendants of the perforated metal flaps that John Northrop and Ed Heinemann designed for the SBD Dauntless. The human stories behind the Midway victory reveal courage and professionalism that transcended technology. Wade McClusky, who led Enterprise's dive. Bombers to the Japanese fleet, despite low fuel and navigational uncertainty, made decisions that changed history. His choice to follow the destroyer Arashi's wake represented tactical brilliance. His willingness to extend his search, despite fuel warnings, demonstrated courage. His execution of the attack showed the professionalism that characterized American naval aviation. Richard Best, whose bomb struck Akagi, flew only 3 more missions after Midway. He'd inhaled caustic soda fumes from his oxygen system during the battle, damaging his lungs. He spent the remainder of the war in hospitals before being medically retired in 1944. He survived until 2001, living long enough to see his contributions recognized as pivotal. Best never claimed to be special. He'd simply done what he'd been trained to do, using equipment designed by engineers who understood that combat effectiveness mattered more than theoretical elegance. Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers, despite having to ditch his bomb prematurely due to electrical problems. He led his squadron through the attack without weapons, drawing anti-aircraft fire away from his wingmen. 3 of his pilots scored hits that destroyed Soryu. Leslie survived the war, retired as a commander, and rarely spoke of Midway except to credit his pilots and the SBD's capabilities. The dive bomber rear gunners deserve recognition often overlooked in accounts focusing on pilots. These men flew backward, operating twin machine guns while their aircraft dove at 250 mph and pulled crushing G-forces during recovery. They provided critical defensive fire against pursuing fighters. They operated radios, managed navigation equipment, and served as extra eyes scanning for threats. Many rear gunners died defending their aircraft. Radio man James Murray, Richard Best's rear gunner, fought off Zeros during their escape from Akagi. Aviation machinist mate John Snowden, flying with Wade McClusky, tracked their fuel consumption and navigated them home when McClusky's navigation equipment failed. These men were professionals who understood their aircraft and trusted its systems completely. The engineering teams at Douglas Aircraft who designed the SBD never received public recognition comparable to fighter designers like Dutch Kindleberger at North American or Ed Heinemann's later fame. But their work was fundamental to American victory. Chief Engineer Ed Heinemann, who would later design the A-1 Skyraider and A-4 Skyhawk, led the team that refined the dive brake system. His philosophy emphasized simplicity and reliability over complexity and theoretical performance. The perforated split flaps embodied this philosophy perfectly. Heinemann later recalled that the dive brake design emerged from methodical testing rather than brilliant inspiration. Engineers built wind tunnel models with various configurations. They tested solid flaps, slotted flaps, perforated flaps with different hole patterns, and various deployment angles. The winning configuration was selected because it produced predictable drag across the widest range of conditions with the least tendency to cause buffeting or control problems. "We weren't trying to be elegant," Heinemann said in a 1975 interview. "We were trying to make something that would work every time for pilots who had to use it when people were shooting at them." The production engineering that allowed Douglas to build nearly 6,000 SBDs reflected American industrial capability. The aircraft used mostly conventional materials and manufacturing techniques. The fuselage was aluminum alloy semi-monocoque construction, standard for the era. The wings used aluminum spars and ribs with aluminum skin. The dive brakes were stamped metal with precisely drilled perforations. Nothing exotic. Nothing that required specialized facilities or materials. This meant production could scale rapidly, and aircraft could be maintained in forward areas with limited facilities. Contrast this with Japanese aircraft production, which emphasized performance over manufacturability. The Zero achieved its remarkable range and maneuverability partly through extensive use of hand fitting and individual adjustment. Each aircraft required significantly more skilled labor hours than comparable American aircraft. When battle damage occurred, repairs required skilled craftsmen who could match the original hand fitting. This approach produced excellent individual aircraft, but limited production volume and complicated field maintenance. The SBD's ruggedness proved critical for carrier operations. Landing a 10,000-pound aircraft on a carrier deck pitching in heavy seas required structural strength. The SBD's reinforced landing gear and strong airframe absorbed harsh landings that would have damaged more delicate aircraft. Pilots reported the SBD could take battle damage and keep flying. One returned to Enterprise with over 200 bullet holes. Another landed successfully after losing 3 feet of its right wing to a Zero's cannon fire. The structural overdesign that made the SBD heavier than necessary for pure performance made it reliable under combat conditions. The dive brake mechanism's reliability was equally critical. The hydraulic or electric systems that deployed the flaps had to function after the aircraft absorbed battle damage, after extended exposure to salt spray, and after maintenance by crews working on pitching carrier decks. The mechanism was deliberately overbuilt. Multiple redundancies ensured that if one actuator failed, others could deploy the flaps. Manual backup systems allowed pilots to deploy flaps mechanically if electrical systems failed. This redundancy saved lives. Multiple pilots reported deploying dive brakes with damaged hydraulics, using manual systems to complete their attacks. The tactical evolution of dive bombing doctrine continued throughout the war as American forces refined what had worked at Midway. Coordination between fighters, dive, bombers, and torpedo bombers improved. Radar enabled earlier detection of targets and better positioning for attacks. Strike group commanders developed techniques for overwhelming carrier defenses through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The Anvil attack profile, where torpedo bombers approached from one direction, while dive bombers struck from perpendicular direction, forced carriers to choose which threat to maneuver against, ensuring that one attacking group would have favorable attack geometry. Intelligence integration improved dramatically after Midway. Code breaking provided advance warning of Japanese movements. Photo reconnaissance located targets precisely. Weather forecasting enabled operations planning that maximized combat effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy forces. The infrastructure supporting carrier operations became as important as the aircraft themselves. Training pipelines expanded to produce the pilots and aircrew needed for the expanding carrier force. Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida processed thousands of student pilots through primary and basic training. Advanced training occurred at specialized facilities. Naval Air Station Jacksonville for carrier qualifications, Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale for dive bombing, Naval Air Station Corpus Christi for navigation and instruments. By 1944, the training pipeline produced more qualified carrier pilots monthly than Japan trained in a year. The SBD began transitioning to second-line duties in 1944 as the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver entered service. The Helldiver carried a heavier bomb load, had longer range, and flew faster than the SBD. But pilots initially disliked it. The SB-2C was larger, heavier, and less forgiving than the Dauntless. Early models suffered mechanical problems. Pilots called it son of a bitch second class, or big-tailed beast. It took months of modifications and pilot familiarization before the Helldiver achieved the reliability that pilots expected from the SBD. Many Marine Corps squadrons retained SBDs throughout the war, preferring the proven aircraft over the problematic Helldiver. Marine Air Group 12, operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flew SBDs in close air support missions supporting ground forces. The accuracy that made the SBD effective against ships proved equally valuable against Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. Marine pilots developed tactics for attacking ground targets from low altitude, using the dive brakes to control speed during shallow approaches that maximize time on target while minimizing exposure to ground fire. The strategic impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan's loss of 4 carriers and their experienced aircrew meant that subsequent operations occurred without the carrier air cover that had enabled earlier successes. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, saw Japanese forces attempting to recapture the island without effective carrier support. Land-based aircraft flying from Rabaul lacked the range and flexibility of carrier aviation. American forces, while initially operating with only 2 carriers after Yorktown's loss, could concentrate carrier air power at critical moments, while Japanese carriers remained distant or absent. The production battle that followed Midway demonstrated American industrial advantages that technology alone couldn't overcome. By 1943, American shipyards were launching Essex-class fleet carriers every 6 weeks. Each carrier embarked 90 to 100 aircraft. Supporting them were light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls, and massive, shore-based infrastructure for training, maintenance, and logistics. Japan, despite heroic efforts, could not match this production pace. Japanese shipyards launched no fleet carriers between 1941 and 1944, focusing instead on converting battleships and cruisers under construction. The converted carriers lacked the hangar capacity, deck space, and aircraft capacity of purpose-built fleet carriers. Aircraft production followed similar patterns. American factories produced 21,000 carrier-capable aircraft between 1942 and 1945, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Japanese production totaled approximately 11,000 carrier aircraft over the same period, and quality declined as experienced workers were drafted into military service and materials became scarce. By 1944, newly manufactured Japanese aircraft showed defects that would have failed pre-war quality inspections. Control surfaces didn't align properly. Engines required extensive adjustment before reaching rated power. Structural components showed stress cracks after minimal flight hours. The human cost of the Pacific Carrier War remains difficult to comprehend fully. American carrier aviation lost approximately 12,000 aircrew, killed in combat, or operational accidents between 1941 and 1945. Japanese losses exceeded 18,000 carrier aircrew. These numbers represent not just individual tragedies, but the systematic destruction of institutional knowledge and experience. The veteran pilots who survived 1942 and 1943 carried lessons learned through combat that couldn't be taught in training. Their loss degraded Japanese carrier aviation's effectiveness far beyond the simple numerical losses. The dive brake technology that proved decisive at Midway represented a specific solution to a specific problem: how to deliver bombs accurately against maneuvering ships defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The perforated split flaps that Japanese intelligence dismissed as crude were actually elegant solutions to a complex problem. They were simple enough to manufacture in quantity, reliable enough to function under combat conditions, and effective enough to enable attack profiles that were tactically decisive. The broader lesson transcends the specific technology. Military effectiveness derives not from theoretical performance specifications, but from practical capability under combat conditions. The SBD Dauntless was slower than Japanese dive bombers, less maneuverable than fighters, and less impressive in specifications than more modern designs. But it could deliver 1,000-pound bombs onto carrier decks with devastating accuracy while surviving combat damage and operating from carrier decks in terrible weather. These practical capabilities mattered more than speed records or performance specifications. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing American aircraft before Midway made the classic mistake of confusing sophistication with effectiveness. The dive brakes looked crude compared to sleeker Japanese aircraft designs, but crude technology that works reliably under combat conditions defeats sophisticated technology that fails under stress. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout military history. Simple, robust solutions implemented effectively consistently defeat elegant solutions that prove fragile in practice. The engineers at Douglas Aircraft who designed the SBD's dive brakes understood implicitly what Japanese intelligence analysts missed. Combat aircraft exist in a brutally unforgiving environment. Salt spray corrodes components. Vibration loosens fasteners. Battle damage destroys systems. Maintenance occurs in primitive conditions by exhausted crews working in darkness. Any system, no matter how clever, must function reliably despite all this abuse. The perforated split flaps that looked so unsophisticated represented thousands of hours of testing and refinement to ensure they would deploy reliably every single time pilots needed them. The 5 minutes over the Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, validated every design choice, every engineering compromise, every manufacturing decision that had gone into creating the SBD Dauntless and its dive brake system. The bombs that destroyed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were delivered by aircraft that did exactly what their designers intended, under conditions as stressful as any in military aviation history. Pilots diving through intense anti-aircraft fire at 250 mph in 70-degree dives toward maneuvering targets relied on dive brakes that deployed smoothly, created predictable drag, and allowed the precision bombing that changed the war's course. Wade McClusky, reflecting on Midway in interviews decades later, always emphasized the role of the aircraft and its systems in the victory. "We had good intelligence that put us in the right place," he said in 1982. "We had courage from pilots who pressed their attacks, but we also had aircraft that worked. Those dive brakes let us do what we trained to do. We dove from altitude where they couldn't see us. We controlled our speed through the dive. We aimed accurately, and we recovered safely. Everything worked as designed. That's why we won." The technical specifications of the dive brake system reflected this design philosophy. The perforated split flaps extended approximately 90 degrees from the wing's trailing edge when fully deployed. Each flap section measured roughly 36 inches in chord by 90 inches span, creating significant surface area. The perforations, approximately 2 inches in diameter, covered about 30% of the flap surface. This perforation ratio was carefully calculated to provide maximum drag while preventing buffeting and maintaining control authority. The deployment mechanism used either hydraulic or electric actuators depending on SBD variant. Early models used hydraulic systems with manual backup. Later variants used electric actuators with hydraulic backup. This redundancy ensured deployment reliability. Pilots reported the flaps deployed smoothly and consistently across the entire speed range. The system required minimal maintenance, regular lubrication, visual inspection for cracks or damage, and periodic hydraulic fluid checks. Mechanics could perform these tasks quickly with basic tools. The drag coefficient created by deployed dive brakes was approximately 0.15, adding substantial resistance to the aircraft's forward motion. Combined with the SBD's base drag coefficient of approximately 0.025 clean and 0.045 with landing gear extended, the deployed dive brakes dominated the drag equation. At terminal velocity in a 70-degree dive, the drag force balanced gravitational acceleration, resulting in the steady 250 mph that pilots found optimal for accurate bombing. The G-forces during recovery from 70-degree dives approached 5 to 6 G when pilots pulled out aggressively. The SBD's structure was designed to withstand 7 G positive loads, providing adequate margin for combat maneuvering. Pilots learned to modulate their pullout to balance recovery altitude against G loading. Pulling too hard caused tunnel vision or loss of consciousness. Pulling too gently meant recovering closer to the water, with less margin for error. Experienced pilots developed an instinctive feel for the optimal pullout profile. The combat effectiveness statistics from Midway and subsequent battles documented the dive brake's tactical value. At Midway, American dive bombers achieved approximately 40% hit rates against maneuvering carriers defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. This accuracy exceeded level bombing by an order of magnitude. B-17 flying fortresses attacking the same Japanese carriers from high altitude that morning had scored no hits despite dropping dozens of bombs. The steep diving angle and controlled descent speed that dive brakes enabled were decisive factors in achieving accuracy that level bombing couldn't match. Throughout the remainder of 1942 and into 1943, SBD hit rates against moving targets remained between 35% and 50%, far exceeding other bombing methods. Against stationary or slow-moving targets, hit rates approached 70%. These accuracy figures translated directly into strategic impact. Fewer aircraft were needed to achieve destruction of high-value targets. Fewer pilots were exposed to defensive fire. Mission efficiency improved dramatically. The economic analysis of dive bombing versus level bombing revealed additional advantages. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from a dive bomber cost the same as a 1,000-pound bomb dropped from a level bomber. But the dive bomber required one sortie to achieve what might require 10 level bomber sorties against defended maneuvering targets. This efficiency multiplier meant that carrier deck space, fuel capacity, ordnance stores, and pilot availability all favored dive bomber employment for anti-shipping missions. The Japanese response to American dive bombing capabilities evolved throughout the war, but never fully countered the threat. Carrier fighter strength increased from 18 aircraft per carrier in 1942 to 27 aircraft per carrier by 1944. Combat air patrol procedures emphasized maintaining fighters at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, where they could intercept dive bombers before attacks commenced. But American fighter escorts increasingly neutralized this defensive strategy. By 1944, American carriers typically launched strikes with fighter escorts outnumbering the combined dive bomber and torpedo bomber force. These escorts swept defending fighters from the sky before bombers attacked. Anti-aircraft armament improvements proved equally insufficient. Japanese carriers and escorts added 25mm automatic cannons and increased 127mm gun installations. Fire control systems improved with radar directors appearing on major combatants by 1944, but the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. Dive bombers attacking from directly above at steep angles presented difficult targets for fire control systems designed primarily for level or slightly diving targets. The brief exposure time, approximately 35 seconds from roll-in to pull-out, gave gunners minimal opportunity to track, aim, and fire effectively. The strategic consequences of dive bombing effectiveness shaped naval doctrine for decades. Post-war carrier operations maintained dive bombing as primary anti-ship capability through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The Douglas AD Skyraider, designed by Ed Heinemann's team using lessons from the SBD, served as the U.S. Navy's primary attack aircraft from 1946 through the early 1970s. The Skyraider incorporated sophisticated dive brakes derived from SBD principles, enabling precision attacks in Korea and Vietnam. Jet aircraft complicated dive bombing mechanics. Early jet engines produced thrust that varied significantly with altitude and airspeed, making consistent terminal velocity more difficult to achieve. Speed brakes had to be larger and more sophisticated to generate sufficient drag at higher speeds. The A-4 Skyhawk, another Heinemann design, incorporated perforated speed brakes on the fuselage that deployed hydraulically. The A-7 Corsair II used slotted speed brakes beneath the fuselage. Modern strike fighters like the FA-18 use computer-controlled speed brakes integrated with flight control systems. The evolution from perforated metal flaps on the SBD to computer-controlled speed brake systems on modern fighters represents technological progression, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Controlling descent velocity during weapons delivery improves accuracy and survivability. The engineers who designed the SBD's dive brakes in 1938 understood this principle instinctively. Their solution, optimized for 1940s technology and materials, proved devastatingly effective. Modern solutions use different technologies but address the same requirement. The human dimension of the dive brake story centers on the pilots and aircrew who trusted the technology with their lives. Diving at 70 degrees toward targets shooting at you requires absolute confidence that your aircraft will behave predictably. The dive brakes had to deploy smoothly every time. The aircraft had to maintain control authority through the dive. The structure had to withstand pull-out G-forces. Failures in any system meant death. The reliability record speaks to the engineering quality. Throughout the war, SBD dive brake system failures were extraordinarily rare. Of the 5,936 SBDs produced, combat loss records show only a handful of incidents where dive brake malfunction contributed to aircraft loss. The system was so reliable that pilots simply expected it to work, focusing their attention on navigation, target acquisition, and defensive maneuvering rather than worrying about equipment failure. This reliability resulted from systematic testing and continuous improvement. Douglas engineers tracked every reported problem, analyzed failures, and implemented design changes in production. Early SBDs showed occasional hydraulic leaks in the dive brake actuators. Improved seals fixed the problem. Some aircraft experienced buffeting at specific speeds. Aerodynamic refinements eliminated the issue. The production aircraft delivered in 1942 incorporated dozens of improvements over the 1940 prototypes, each addressing problems discovered through testing or combat use. The maintenance procedures for dive brake systems were deliberately simple. Mechanics performing pre-flight inspections visually checked for hydraulic leaks, verified flap movement through manual operation, and confirmed electrical connections. This inspection took approximately 5 minutes per aircraft. More detailed inspections occurred during scheduled maintenance, typically after every 100 flight hours. The entire dive brake system could be removed and replaced in approximately 4 hours if damage required replacement rather than repair. This maintainability proved critical for carrier operations, where maintenance facilities were primitive compared to shore-based installations. Aircraft carriers in 1942 lacked the sophisticated tools and equipment available at major air stations. Mechanics worked in cramped hangar spaces, often in rough seas that made precision work difficult. They performed maintenance by flashlight during night operations. The dive brake system had to be serviceable under these conditions. Its simple, robust design made this possible. The training pipeline for dive bomber pilots emphasized mastery of the dive brake system. Student pilots at advanced training learn to deploy brakes smoothly during transition to the dive, maintain constant speed through adjustments to angle and throttle, and retract brakes during pullout to maximize acceleration away from the target. Instructors emphasized that the dive brakes were the key to accurate bombing and safe recovery. Pilots who failed to master dive brake employment washed out of the program. Training accidents involving dive brake malfunctions were rare but instructive. When failures occurred, investigation revealed that almost all resulted from pilot error, attempting to deploy brakes at excessive speed, failing to verify deployment before entering steep dives, or pulling out with brakes still deployed. Actual mechanical failures were extraordinarily uncommon, testament to the system's reliability. The lessons from each accident informed updates to training curriculum and operational procedures. The cultural impact of Midway and the dive bombers' success rippled through American society in ways that transcended military significance. The battle occurred at a moment when American morale desperately needed positive news. 6 months of defeat and retreat across the Pacific had created doubt about whether America could compete with Japanese forces. Midway provided proof that American forces could defeat Japan decisively. The dive bomber pilots became national heroes. Their aircraft became symbols of American technical capability and fighting spirit. War bond drives featured SBD Dauntlesses prominently. Posters showed dive bombers attacking Japanese carriers. Newsreels screened in theaters nationwide featured footage of SBDs taking off from carriers, attacking targets, and returning safely. The simple, rugged appearance of the aircraft resonated with American sensibilities. It looked like something that worked rather than something designed for show. This aesthetic aligned with American self-perception: practical, effective, focused on results rather than appearances. The industrial workers building SBDs understood they were producing weapons that were actually defeating the enemy. Douglas aircraft plants in El Segundo, California, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, employed thousands of workers building Dauntlesses. Production lines operated 3 shifts around the clock. Workers saw photographs of their aircraft attacking Japanese ships. They read accounts of battles where SBDs proved decisive. This connection between industrial production and combat effectiveness motivated quality work. Workers took pride in building aircraft they knew were making a difference. The post-war analysis of Midway by military historians and strategists emphasized the battle's decisive nature. Samuel Eliot Morrison, in his official history of U.S. naval operations, called Midway the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes represented a turning point from which Japan never recovered. American carrier strength grew, while Japanese carrier strength declined. By 1944, the United States operated over 100 carriers of various types, while Japan struggled to maintain a dozen operational carriers. The dive bombers that achieved this decisive victory used technology that Japanese intelligence had dismissed. The perforated split flaps that seemed so crude enabled the precision attacks that destroyed Japan's carrier striking force. This technological underestimation reflected broader Japanese failures in assessing American capabilities. Japanese planners assumed American industrial production emphasized quantity over quality, that American weapons were adequate but not sophisticated, that American forces lacked the fighting spirit and tactical proficiency of Japanese forces. Each assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The final irony is that Japanese aircraft designers understood dive brake technology and had incorporated similar systems in their own aircraft. The Aichi D-3A Val featured dive brakes that functioned similarly to the SBD's system. Japanese pilots trained in dive bombing techniques comparable to American methods. But Japanese naval doctrine never emphasized dive bombing to the degree American doctrine did. Japanese carriers typically embarked more fighters and torpedo bombers relative to dive bombers compared to American carriers. This doctrinal choice meant that when massed dive bomber attacks occurred, Japan's carriers faced a threat their defensive systems weren't optimized to defeat. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that wars are won not by theoretical capability, but by practical effectiveness under combat conditions. The SBD Dauntless, with its seemingly crude dive brakes, proved more effective than sleeker, faster Japanese aircraft because it could perform its primary mission: accurate delivery of bombs against defended targets, reliably and repeatedly. The technology wasn't revolutionary. The engineering wasn't exotic, but it worked perfectly for its intended purpose, and that perfection decided the outcome of history's most important carrier battle. The perforated metal flaps that Japanese intelligence officers dismissed in 1941 as evidence of American technological backwardness destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in June 1942, shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific, and validated American engineering philosophy that emphasized practical solutions over theoretical elegance. The Crude became decisive, the dismissed became determinative, and the dive brakes that seemed so unsophisticated enabled the most devastating 5 minutes in Japanese naval history, proving that in warfare, effectiveness matters infinitely more than sophistication and practical solutions. Consistently defeat elegant theories when both face the ultimate test of combat.